Hello, welcome to the Red Pill Central channel. This first video I'm making is going to be about red pill moments. Red pill moments is the currently fashionable term for aha moments or epiphanies. That's when some new information comes into your consciousness that upsets your current worldview. Back in the 60s we called it going through changes. These can happen as a result of reading a passage from a book, or hearing a lecture, or a conversation with a stranger, or watching a movie, or even a YouTube video. You can be red-pilled by narrowly escaping death, by losing a loved one, or by being sent to prison. These experiences do not, in themselves, mean that you will be red-pilled, but they can mean that. It all depends on your openness at the time, and the vulnerability of your current mindset. Someone who has very rigid, fixed opinions is less likely to be able to incorporate the new data into his mindset. It's axiomatic that people's perceptions are more influenced by their beliefs than their beliefs are influenced by their perceptions. But sometimes the new perceptions are so powerful and so impossible to ignore or deny that they must be reckoned with. Some examples might be if you trusted someone and found out that they were cheating or caught in a blatant lie, or the head of an organization you thought very highly of is discovered to be a fraud, or you see something in the news and later see a video taken from the scene and it is 180 degrees at odds with what the news report said. The new information shoots a hole in the edifice of your belief system, and often the whole system comes crashing down. Some call this going down the rabbit hole. You find out about an obvious lie in a news report. Well, then what else might they be lying about? Who can you believe now? It's normal for there to be a period of confusion and cognitive dissonance after a major red pilling. It takes time to integrate the new information into a coherent set of beliefs, be it about the world, the universe, or yourself. So, I want to share with you some of my red pill moments, and I invite you to share yours in the comments. One of the earliest red pill moments I can remember was when I was about 17. I was raised mostly as a Catholic, but I attended another church called Unity between the ages of about 8 and 17. They were very different. Unity is in the New Thought branch of Christianity and draws from many of the world's religions. My parents left the Catholic Church when I was about 8 and went to Unity Church for about 9 years. Then, for reasons unknown to me, they decided to go back to Catholicism and have me take catechism classes. These classes didn't make much sense to me. I couldn't buy the concept of original sin, or that my sins in some way offended God. That seemed like giving human qualities to God. Another question that bothered me was, if God was so just, why all the inequality and suffering in the world? If all were created equal, then why the obvious fact that all are not born equal? I rationalized that maybe just everyone is equal in the eyes of God. Around the age of 17, I became aware of Edgar Cayce by reading a book called Many Mansions. Cayce was a psychic who lived in Virginia Beach and did life readings on people, sometimes at great distances. These readings were in great depth, covering physical, emotional, spiritual, and psychological aspects of the subject's life. There's a huge amount of documentation archived in the organization he founded, the Association for Research and Enlightenment in Virginia Beach, showing how people were healed of seemingly incurable conditions by following Cayce's advice. He described conditions in the bodies of people he had never seen, who were sometimes thousands of miles away, that were later verified by actual physical examinations. He was a fundamentalist Christian, but when in a self-induced trance, which is when he gave his readings, he talked very differently. He talked of current conditions as having their origin in past lives. Aha, I thought, this might explain the riddle of inequality. Perhaps we were all created equal, but during our many sojourns here on earth, some of us went in good directions and some in bad. According to Cayce, our station in this life is a reflection of what we did in our past lives. In other words, karma. This would explain child prodigies, birth defects, mental retardation, and most other afflictions that beset humanity unequally. According to Cayce, not only is there physical evolution, but there's evolution of the soul. This was a major shift in my worldview. No longer did I fear death. No longer did I worry about whether I was going to heaven or hell. I now know that my problems are of my own making, and that it's up to me to solve them. But also that there are more advanced souls than I who are trying to help those of us who are still struggling and lost in illusion, and that by helping others I can build good karma and improve my future circumstances. My major red pilling regarding the mass media was started by two things: 9/11 and the Iraq War. On 9/11, when it first happened, I thought that we were attacked, just as George W. said. I believed this for some time, but there was an uneasiness about the way the towers just suddenly collapsed, an hour or two after being hit. I watched the video of the collapses over and over, and my uneasiness grew. I saw them not just collapse, but be completely pulverized, leaving no large pieces. I saw the top of one of the towers begin to tilt sideways, which I thought was natural since the plane hit one side of the tower. However, the portion of the tower that looked like it should tip over and fall next to the tower simply dissolved. This seemed weird, but I didn't really have any conspiracy theories about it. Yet. It was several years before I ran across a video here on YouTube called The Anatomy of a Great Deception. Here are a few excerpts from that video.
My awakening began with a simple question. It occurred as I watched a familiar clip of President Bush on the morning of 9/11. I didn't realize it then, but this question was about to change my life. Bush is sitting at Booker Elementary School in Sarasota, Florida at 9:05 a.m. when White House Chief of Staff Andrew Card whispers into the president's ear.
A second plane has hit the second tower. America is under attack.
That first question was, why didn't the Secret Service get him out of there immediately? They didn't know how many planes were hijacked yet or what their targets were.
There were actually 8 planes that were hijacked.
We had 11 reports of hijacked aircraft.
There were thousands of planes still flying. As many as a dozen planes were reported hijacked at one point. And it was no secret the president was there. The school visit had been made public on September 7th, 4 days prior to 9/11. How could anyone be so sure hijackers weren't already on the way? Yet there he lingered, even after 2 more flights were confirmed hijacked, Flight 77 and Flight 93, the Pentagon and Shanksville planes respectively. Somewhere I saw a story claiming the president's camp didn't want to scare the kids at the school, and that's why he stayed, which I found hard to believe. Well-trained professionals are going to risk the balance of power in the world to spare the feelings of a few kids who routinely practice fire drills anyway? Well, I guess the answer was yes, because Bush stayed until 9:34 a.m., a full 29 minutes after it was known we were under attack. Think about that. That would have been 29 grueling minutes for everyone, especially those assigned to protect the president, wondering if some hijackers gotten ambitious, maybe changed their plans in the last few days after the school visit was made public. I guess someone high up in the president's camp must have known or thought they were safe. I mean, what else could it be? But how could anyone have known that? It had me thinking, but it wasn't a huge deal. I was more intrigued by the type of people I came across who also had similar questions about 9/11. These weren't conspiracy theorists as I pictured them. These were people in government, aviation, civil defense, architecture, science, engineering, and the military. I decided to look further. I still had no idea the impact this would have on my life. I started by refamiliarizing myself with the incident, or I should say set of incidents. Of course, we all remember the second tower being hit, but I hadn't put much thought into the other parts of that day. And soon after looking, I was reminded that there were several incredible events on 9/11. I'd put almost no thought into the particulars of that day for 10 years. But that was about to change. In chronological order, the official version goes like this. 4 planes were hijacked by 19 mostly Saudi Arabian terrorists who then flew or attempted to fly those planes into 4 U.S. buildings: World Trade Center 1, World Trade Center 2, the Pentagon, and the U.S. Capitol. 3 of them were successful. American Airlines Flight 11 hit the first tower, the North Tower, at 8:46 a.m. United Airlines Flight 175 hit the South Tower at 9:03 a.m. American Airlines Flight 77 hit the Pentagon at 9:37 a.m. At 9:59, the South Tower collapsed after burning for less than an hour. At 10:07 a.m., United Flight 93 crashed in a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Then at 10:28 a.m., the North Tower collapsed. And I barely remembered that a third building at the World Trade Center, Building 7, collapsed at 5:20 p.m. to close out the day. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, more commonly known as NIST, backed up the official government version that intense fires weakened the steel and caused all three buildings to fail, including Building 7, which oddly enough was not hit by an airplane, nor was it exposed to jet fuel, which is what I thought melted the towers to get that progressive collapse started.
And you had that intense heat probably weakened the structure as well.
As I looked for answers, I found Shyam Sunder of NIST stating, "The buildings were not brought down by explosives. Until then, I didn't know explosives were even in the conversation. And like hearing a child claim innocence before a question is even posed, it had my eyebrow raised."
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
It was time to take a crash course in high-rise fires. It seems that high-rise fires are more common than I thought. I found hundreds of them. According to a 2011 report by the National Fire Protection Association, there are an average of 110 fires each year in buildings over 13 stories tall. According to the report, between 2005 and 2009, there were 550 high-rise fires. Of course, there are many more all throughout history, but let's talk about some of the more startling ones. Sao Paulo, Brazil, the Joelma building, 1974. Sparked by an electrical fire, the residential building burned twice as long as the Twin Towers, yet it stood. The underlying structure wasn't even weakened. In fact, it's still in use today. The MGM Grand, which is now Bally's in Las Vegas, Nevada, caught fire in 1980, killing 85 people. It's had a few facelifts and ownership changes, but the structure underneath was never compromised. It's still in use today. Los Angeles, California, 1988. What was then called the First Interstate Bank building burned for 3.5 hours. No structural failure at all. In fact, an insurance company moved in, and today it's known as the Aon Center. Chechnya's tallest building burned for 7 hours in April 2013. It stood. Dubai, Moscow, Zurich, and on and on. I was starting to see a trend. Fires don't melt steel or cause buildings to collapse. Sometimes buildings do collapse because of structural failure, but it's usually a design problem or earthquake damage or a controlled demolition. Buildings don't come down because of fire, but when they do collapse, they tend to tip over and stay connected. After reviewing hundreds of fires, I could find only 3 occurrences of fire bringing down a steel-framed high-rise in all of history, and all 3 were on 9/11.
High-rise buildings simply do not collapse due to fire.
Collapse of World Trade Center 7 was primarily due to fire.
But there's a problem. Office and open-air jet fuel fires cannot melt steel.
A lot of things in these kind of buildings have to be fire-resistant by nature. It's required by code. So there really isn't a whole lot of fuel in there to begin with.
The National Institute of Standards and Technology said that the maximum air temperatures was about 1,800 degrees or 1,000 degrees colder than what's needed to melt steel.
And it takes a blast furnace with air blowing with blowers to try to get steel to melt.
So if you have a flame at 750 degrees, you can hold that flame under a steel beam forever, and you'll never reach a high enough temperature to bend steel, let alone melt it.
This would have us to believe that these was a typical office fire, scattered office fires, if you will, that brought this building down. Since the mid-60s, I've tried to follow high-rise fires, and I'm not aware of any high-rise building that have come down as a result of fires.
And seeing black smoke come out the windows, that means that the fires were oxygen-starved.
Kerosene would have burned off very quickly. What wasn't destroyed in the initial fireball would have been consumed fairly rapidly and would have only really served as an ignition for the rest of the material.
The bottom line is this. Steel-framed high-rises don't collapse, especially into their own footprint, because of fire. This is why builders and architects have loved steel for 100 years. A fire typically can't compromise the steel structure. Of course, 9/11 was not a typical day with typical fires. Jet fuel was involved. But the kerosene or the jet fuel just can't explain it. I needed to hear from some experts.
It just didn't add up, the way the whole thing sort of pile drove itself into the ground and all at near free fall speed.
Collapses straight down into its own footprint at free fall speed. This is uncanny. There's 40,000 tons of structural steel designed to resist this collapse.
This building had 40,000 tons of structural steel in its structural system, and that is intended to keep it from going anywhere.
The animation sequence from the National Institute of Standards and Technology for their model, their mathematical model of the collapse of Building Number 7. And they have the inside members that one column gave way, which they claim resulted in the collapse of all the surrounding members, and then this precipitated a global collapse. This would just not be physically possible for a gravitational collapse.
It was time to take a closer look at NIST. They are the scientific agency backing the official version of events as most Americans know them. I was hoping they would curb my growing anxiety. Instead, what I learned about NIST made my heart sink. To understand NIST, you need to understand the relationship to explosives. They have vehemently denied that there were any. Not only did they not check for them, they state that none were used. Plain and simple. In fact, they have gone to unbelievable lengths to prove that explosives, or even the evidence of explosives, like pops going off, did not exist.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
So the preconceived notion of NIST is that there's no evidence for explosives, and so there's no point in looking. That is the most unscientific thing that you can possibly think of, not to look because you don't expect to find evidence, and in fact the evidence is overwhelming.
Did not find any evidence that explosives were used in the collapse.
Is that a secondary explosion? Yes, it was.
That was the
Yeah, definitely secondary explosion.
Secondary explosions, sometimes described as pops or booms, are mini detonations apart from the primary explosion of the plane impacts. These types of explosions are routine in a controlled demolition. They were heard in all three buildings long before any collapsed.
Like, it sounded like gunfire, you know, bang, 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 and then all of a sudden, 3 big explosions.
That sound was not picked up by any of the videos or witnesses that we have talked to.
You heard explosions, like boom.
We just heard one more explosion. That's about the 4th one we've heard.
CNN is now reporting that there was a 3rd explosion at the World Trade Center.
Okay, you get the point. Why was NIST denying these explosions? Why are they a big deal? Well, those explosions are a strong sign of a controlled demolition, but they're not proof positive of one. If it was a controlled demolition, there would be other signs like misfired explosives and particles in the dust. When I see John Gross fidget and blush as he states there was no molten metal, I see a man that is doing what many of us do when we don't tell the truth. It's basic human nature. My feelings at the time were like the moment you catch your significant other in a lie. Maybe there's an explanation, but your heart is racing until you get some answers. And if something like that's ever happened to you, you may understand needing to know more, but not wanting to know more, if that makes sense. But maybe there was an explanation for the collapse and the plane impacts themselves. The first interview I came across was of Frank DeMartini, the construction manager of the World Trade Center.
The building was designed to have a fully loaded 707 crash into it. That was the largest plane at the time. The building probably could sustain multiple impacts of jetliners because this structure is like the mosquito netting on your screen door. The jet plane is just a pencil puncturing that screen netting. It really does nothing to the screen netting.
But the largest aircraft flying today, at least commercially, the 747, fully loaded, is on the order of 300 tons. So if you think about a 300-ton element crashing into a building that's been designed to carry 13,000 tons, you can see that an aircraft crashing into the World Trade Center would probably not do anything.
And it's my expert opinion, as a demolition expert, I was trained by the best the U.S. government has. I served 3 years on Underwater Demolition Team 12. 2 years I was attached to SEAL Team 1. And when I look at the buildings and how they fall and the way they fell, They couldn't have come down without being assisted in some manner.
The only way that a building can accelerate as it collapses is by having pre-engineered, precisely timed, and precisely placed explosives. In other words, controlled demolition.
The collapse of the building was caused by controlled demolition.
In fact, the evidence shows very strongly that there were explosives used in the way the buildings came down.
We started running floor by floor instead of popping out. It was as if they had detonated. Yeah, detonated. They were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom. All the way down.
Explosives are used to demolish buildings like this in just seconds. Okay, so it's a controlled demolition. What's the problem with that? Let's just think about this. Controlled demolitions cannot be engineered and rigged in a day. It takes months. And therefore, this event must have been planned in advance.
The full version of this video, as well as another video called 911, A New Pearl Harbor, will be linked in the description below. These videos, among other things, completely destroyed my trust in the mass media and in our government. They left me wondering how could such a huge hoax be perpetrated on the American public, and indeed most of the Western world, and hardly anybody know about it or believe it. The immense power of the mass media to manufacture and create a false consensus reality slowly began to sink in. I was too far down the rabbit hole now, and there was no turning back. As I continued to research 9/11, I also began to question the official versions of other events of history. In the next video, I'm going to examine the mass media from about the early part of the 20th century, including World War I, the interwar period, and World War II up until the Cold War, and see how mass media has influenced public opinion, how it has enabled us to go to war. I will show how, just as in recent times we were deceived about Iraq, we were also deceived about World War I and World War II.